Yay, okay. Hi everyone, I'm Eytan Adar. I'm a professor at the University of Michigan. This is joint work with Carolyn, Gearig, Ayshwarya, Balasubramanian, and Jessica Hullman. The two students, Carolyn and Aysh, graduated, so you're stuck with me, much to Casey's dismay. She's worried about how much over I'm gonna go, but I'll try to keep it on time. With news personalization, it's probably worth considering a little bit the history of the way news came to be personalized. So let me just briefly talk about this. There's basically been a technological trajectory within news, where first we were able to produce reliable copies through movable type. And as soon as we had movable type, we could start thinking about scalable printing presses where we could produce many reliable copies. And then we could start thinking about many reliable copies produced quickly. And as soon as you gave that power to journalists and newspaper publishers, they started thinking about ways of personalizing the copies that they made. So the San Jose Mercury News, for example, started publishing different issues for different groups. So if you lived in the peninsula, you'd get a different issue than if you lived in San Francisco, because it was possible to produce different content for these different groups and print it reliably and again at scale. Now, then we started evolving into online content, which sort of ate the market for printed newspapers, but that's okay. As soon as we started doing this, people developed other ways of personalizing online news content, and so you started seeing things like the freshman fish wrap, which was a project in MIT in the 90s, which was able to take news and personalize it at the individual level. As other publishers started coming online and aggregators like Google News started coming online, there's been a remarkable ability to customize news feeds, okay, for any individual based on whatever property you wanted. So you had a lot of fine-grained control over the kinds of news you were consuming. Now this is coming with, of course, various problems and whatnot, but this is something that exists today and happens quite a lot. But most of this has been in the context of personalized feeds, or what I call personalized editions. And the way this works is the journalist comes in and creates some content, and the content goes and sits in an article bank with a bunch of other content. The reader comes along and says, hey, give me some news, and the magic algorithm, which is the feed ranking algorithm, basically says, okay, here, I'm going to produce an edition that's custom for you. Another reader comes along, and she gets a very different edition of the newspaper. So this is what personalized feeds look like. The question that people started asking about 2 years ago within the news community was, why stop at the article level? And why not move from personalized feeds to actual personalized content? Now, this is something we've been doing in academia, like in the hypertext and educational communities, but this is something that was very new for the news community for reasons that I'll explain in a second. So here's an example. This is an article from the New York Times from a couple of years ago, the best and worst places to grow up, how your area compares. Now the New York Times, being a New York-centered newspaper despite its national footprint, targets by default the New York area. So when you go to this article, you're getting a visualization specific to New York and Manhattan. So Manhattan is very bad, has very bad income mobility for children in poor families and so on. So you're getting data that's very specific. The content itself is also very specific. It's referencing Putnam County, which is nearby to Manhattan. You're getting a lot of other data and a lot of other information that's very specific to Manhattan, a reader from Manhattan. But what they did with this article was pretty clever. They basically figured out where you were coming from, and because they had all this data, they were able to automatically customize the article just for you, just for your reading experience. So if you're coming at the article from Denver, as we are today, this is what you would see. You would see a map that's custom fit to Denver with statistics that were specific to Denver. And beyond this, even the article content itself actually changed. Instead of talking about Putnam County, it now talks about Jefferson County, which is nearby, and the statistics all change, like the numbers within the text and all the tables change dynamically. So what's interesting about this is it sort of causes a shift in the way we're thinking about personalized content away from personalized feeds. So this is the way we were working before, where you had many articles and many users, but only one algorithm that sort of mediated between these. So the algorithm would take some properties of the end user, of the reader, and make some decisions about what to show. But now we have a situation where this is different. We don't have just one algorithm anymore. In fact, we have an algorithm that's very specific to every article that's produced. Okay? So article-specific algorithms are basically going to modify the content of that article. So the price nationally was something, but in your area it was blank. We have this kind of Mad Libs fill-in-the-blank thing that the algorithm basically needs to go and modify based on who the reader is and what data the algorithm has access to. So every article in this bank now has its own algorithm associated with it. What this means is that the reader coming in from one place, Sunnydale, gets a very different experience than the reader coming in from Happyville, who sees something very different. Okay? The visualizations change, the content changes, and so on. Okay. What it unfortunately means for the journalist is now, instead of just being able to create the article, she has to think about other things, like actually being a coder. Okay? It's no longer sufficient to just write the article. You have to write the algorithm by which the content and the visualizations change, which, as you might imagine, is particularly difficult. And this is where PersaLog comes in, basically asking the question, how can we help? So we went and surveyed a bunch of journalists and other people in the newsroom, so editors, journalists, graphic designers, both at the national and local level. We had 22 respondents. We also did three in-depth interviews with journalists at the New York Times and the Washington Post. These three were responsible at the time for all existing personalized content articles. So basically any content from those two sites that was personalized had one of these three as an author. The things that they like are probably obvious. These are the things that they pointed out as benefits. It would help you simplify complex data, so if there was something that was particularly hard for a reader to understand, if you could contextualize that information, it became much more easier to parse. It was more relatable, more engaging, and of course more sticky, so they could get people to actually spend more time on their websites, which is important to journalists. That's how they make their money in some ways. They also pointed out to us a number of concerns, which we have changed into basically design criteria. And I'll point you at the paper for sort of in-depth look at many of these, but I'll talk about two specifically. One is within the context of socio-technical issues. Broadly, and some of these crossover. There's things like the filter bubble, there's the desire to signal personalization, there's concern about reader privacy, and there's also the desire to provide reader control. And this is very different for something like the advertising business, where you don't really want people to control your ads, right? You just want to show them what you want to show them. There are also technical issues, which they voiced, concern for the inference quality, like how good are you at guessing where a person is located, their age, their gender, whatever it is that you're inferring. And minimizing complexity for creators was a huge thing, so they wanted it to be easy to build and easy to test. As you might imagine, someone who works in journalism really cares about things like grammar. Okay, so making sure that the content, when it's changed and personalized, actually reads correctly is quite important. So with that in mind, we started building PersaLog, and the way PersaLog works is you can take unpersonalized content and unpersonalized visualizations, and someone in the newsroom can basically augment that with a little bit of code, okay? This is something that we call PersaLog. It's a specific language, domain-specific language that I'll explain in a second, and that gets passed into our server. The server does what's called transpiling, which is converting the code that we get, the PersaLog code, into JavaScript, which makes it portable and usable. And then we can actually render these personalized content pages. On the other side, we have the reader coming in to the PersaLog server, and there's a bunch of user modeling components. And some of them are housed internally and some are external. But basically, we generate a user model based on various properties of the reader. Either they've logged in, or we infer things based on geolocation, based on IP, and so on. Given the user model and this compiled page, we can now render the page. And the experience will then be a completely personalized page for the reader, depending on who they are and where they're coming from. Okay, so the journalist has to create this one page, make this very special and specific changes to it, okay, and then that will be the algorithm that is embedded inside of the page that will support this content personalization. The entire system is implemented in JavaScript, which is usually something that I would never bother sharing with you, but it's interesting because we came at this from the perspective of providing users control over private information. Because of the way we split up and coded this, you can actually divide where the different modules sit, so where they sit in terms of the server and the client. So you can actually do all the inference and the rendering and everything on the client. So if you're concerned about your privacy and don't want to ship any information over to some server, you can basically do that all locally. If you care about scaling in some way, then maybe you would implement everything on the server. Okay, so you can basically divide it up based on whatever task you have in mind. The PersaLog language itself emerged from our consideration of other examples within the hypertext community. So there have been lots and lots of other languages that are very general and actually very hard to use. So they're a little bit too complicated for most novice users to actually learn. There have been visual interfaces, but journalists end up spending all their time within content management systems. Like their habitat is within text, within these CMSs. And so they really wanted to, from our read, basically sit within the CMS and not be doing stuff visually outside. So we designed PersaLog, the language, as something called a little language. This is a philosophy of programming languages, of domain-specific languages. It is not a general language. You can't do everything with it. But it does transpile to JavaScript, in which case you can add additional modules if you really care to. It is not a library. And the other benefit of doing this is by making it very simple and embedding it in the HTML pages that we produce, even the reader can inspect the algorithm by which we are generating content personalization. So that's a positive. The general structure of PersaLog is if this then that kind of framework, but we say if segment then do. So here's a simple example, and I'll refer you to the paper if you want the full gory details. But if the age of the reader is based on inference or logging in or whatever it is, less than 12, then print $3. This is like something that's telling you about pricing for something. Okay, so on the left, if the person belongs to this segment, do this, print something to the screen. Okay, so pretty simple. Okay, so the age thing is a variable. It's basically a facet of the reader. That is basically the only variable that you get to play with. And PersaLog loads up a bunch of these variables based on whatever the journalist's needs are. So age, city, time zone, latitude, longitude, inferred occupation, and so on. All these things can be loaded and made available to the journalist in creating their content. But they don't have to worry about sophisticated variable languages and binding and so on. All that's done for them. The way that's done is we have a bunch of modules that will take in a visitor to the website that is running PersaLog and can do things like conversion between IP address to latitude, longitude, look at what the properties are of the logged in reader, do inference based on the census, like what the demographics are of the local area. Based on past behavior, we can determine interests or things like reading level even. Okay. So we take these people, we shift them through this inference, and we enrich their profiles using this inference. So now what we have is readers plus enriched profiles. Once we have that, we can start thinking about how to segment them. Okay? So segmenting comes by taking whatever we've inferred and breaking it down even further and making decisions about things to show to one group versus the other. So latitude, longitude as a particular thing can be put through a geographic segmenter, and so you see a bunch of people with added information like the state that they're sitting in. Okay, so Florida at the top and New York at the bottom. It can be latitude, longitude, it can be city, zip, county, state, whatever. We can do all these different kinds of inferences and segment based on any of these. We can also do things like closest to. So what city are you closest to when you're coming in? We can do other sophisticated things, like if we've inferred something about your age or you've logged in and you've told us, we can do things like splitting up the population into different age segments. Okay, so here's an example where the population is split into 3 different segments. So the way this is actually done and implemented by the journalist is as simple as this. Okay, so that's basically just an if, else structure. And it's fairly simple to read. I'll talk about an evaluation later on. But you go through the first line. If the age is less than this, print something. If the age is greater than 65, print something else. And the else, the default, is just to print $15. So pretty straightforward. There are examples where there's too many lines that you might want to do, so you certainly would not want to segment and write different lines for every city that someone could possibly live in. So we've created this very simple way of abstracting this. There's a command called segment by, which is basically a way of describing a bunch of if-else statements in a row. So segment by the city, print out you are in whatever city it is, or do something else. The language actually is very forgiving. It was designed this way, so people can write as many of these if this, then that commands on a specific line, and we'll rearrange it to make it work. So if you have some combination of things that you want to segment by and things that you want to do, we'll rearrange them into something logical, so you'll get a conjunction that works, and you don't have to worry about it. So people can just sort of do whatever they want, and it works more or less. So let me give you a few specific examples and what they're particularly used for in terms of personalization. So the PersaLog language has things like geolocation. So I can say something like, if the location of the reader has some distance to a specific coordinate, this happens to be Boston, and I want within 500 miles, I'm going to label this person as close. If not, then they're going to be labeled as far. This is a visualization of a bunch of simulated readers coming and our script being run on them. So each point is a reader. You can see all the points in green. Basically, these are people close to Boston. People who are further away are in this purple bluish shade. Why do we want this? We want this because we can potentially do things like hyperlocalization. So this is an example of where a hyperlocal newspaper might actually benefit from something like this. So if you're coming from somewhere very far away from where this fire is, it happens to be by Globe, Arizona, and if you don't know where that is, that's most of you probably, and myself as well, and you're coming probably from further away, you're going to get the map that's on the left, which is putting the fire location relative to Phoenix, which is something that's a little bit more familiar. But if you're coming close, that is, you're a reader that's close to the fire location, you're going to get a very different map. Okay, so this is something enabled by just that kind of command that's sitting on top. Instead of printing, it's going to tell it to shift the map in a different location. The thing that we use more often within PersaLog is binding to external data, so things like segmenting by some external variables. So we can actually load up a file that has segment names, some variables that we care about, and potentially things like geolocation. So these are the rules for segmentation and additional variables to bind. So here I'm going to segment by whether you're closer to Boston or San Francisco, and people who are closer to Boston will have mean age being bound to 20, closer to Boston 20, closer to San Francisco to be 40. And this is how we actually implement that fill in the blank thing that I showed before. The transpiling, I'm not going to get into. Basically, you take a bunch of this code that's in PersaLog and you get a bunch of sort of readable JavaScript that you could modify if you care. HTML embedding works as you might imagine. You write PersaLog within a comment tag and it modifies automatically and then gets executed and basically augments the code. We inform the user that they are experiencing personalized content by supplying these mouse overs. If you mouse over the content, it tells you what it's personalizing based on. You can also disable the personalization or change the viewpoint. Okay? So you can basically get a re-execution based on a different perspective. We deal with graphics. As I said, we take graphics that existed that were non-personalized and modify them in a specific way so that they can be scripted. It's interesting from a technical perspective, but not from a research perspective. Basically, we're binding and are able to extract the content of which elements are on the screen that are actually scriptable, even things like mouse overs. So you can do things like hover over Florida and modify the visualization automatically. So this is a visualization from The Guardian that was not personalized, and we basically made it so that if you're coming from Florida or a specific state, the hover thing pops up appropriately. We've generated a bunch of test harnesses to allow the journalists to do different kinds of testing. We've performed various evaluations, basically recreating the New York Times and the Post articles, did a bunch of visualization case studies. We took a bunch of journalism students and had them test the language to see if they could interpret it, modify it, and create new content correctly. And they tended to do well. The test was a little bit harder than necessary, so this is a little bit misleading. I actually think they performed better than this. But ask me about that if you care. In terms of future work, we're doing a bunch of things to improve inference and provide access to confidences in our inferences. So if you care about how confident the algorithm is in making a content personalization decision, you can do that. And doing better ways of providing WYSIWYG and other interfaces. So just to summarize, we've created the system that is supposed to help the journalist become a coder, given the specific concerns of the newsroom. So within the habitat of the content management system, are you able to create customized text and graphics in an extensible way? And this is the philosophy of the little language, so it's easier to read and write. And with that, I will end. So thank you. The site persalog.news, you can go there. It's a little shaky, but it works okay. So if you want to try some of these things, you're welcome to. And I welcome your questions and feedback. How over did I go?
I promised you would have been over.
Yeah.